Seattle had been raining for 3 straight
I
days.
just want to know if he's okay.
The kind of rain that didn't fall so much as it lingered, whispering against glass. A rhythm meant to remind people that time still moved, even when their hearts didn't. In a small maternity ward on the east side of the city, Nora Williams sat propped against a stiff hospital pillow. She was 29, exhausted, and more frightened than she would ever admit. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and new beginnings. Her daughter Amara was only 36 hours old and already knew how to cry with her whole body, tiny limbs, shaking lungs, declaring themselves to the world. Nora cradled her close. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mama's here," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The nurse had gone to check another patient. The hallway beyond the curtain hummed with quiet machines and the soft thunder of carts being pushed. Nora hadn't slept more than 10 minutes in a row since the delivery. She hadn't eaten either. Not really, just coffee and the hospital's idea of soup. The truth pressed down on her with every passing hour. She was alone. Her mother was 2 states away, promising to fly out as soon as she could. The baby's father had disappeared the moment Nora told him she wouldn't end the pregnancy. Her friends had texted heart emojis and well wishes before drifting back into their own lives. Now, in the gray stillness of the early morning, Nora's courage began to splinter. Amara's wail rose again, thin and urgent. She tried to nurse, but the baby turned away, frustrated, her small face twisting in hunger. The hospital's vending machine clanked somewhere down the hall. With trembling hands, Nora reached for her phone. She wanted to text someone, anyone, just to feel less invisible. She typed a message meant for Emma, her old co-worker from the design firm. "She's hungry again. I don't know what I'm doing. I just wish someone was here." She attached a photo the nurse had taken earlier. Amara swaddled, eyes closed, her tiny wrist wrapped in a paper ID band. Nora hesitated, then hit send. The phone screen blinked. The contact suggestion read, "Evan Hartley, not Emma." She didn't notice. And just like that, the message flew into the dark. Across town, in a penthouse wrapped in glass and quiet, Evan Hartley sat alone in the dim light of his office. The city spread beneath him like a reflection of stars that had forgotten how to shine. He was 37, founder and CEO of Hartley & Row Publishing, a man the newspapers called the visionary of the Northwest. But tonight, he felt anything but visionary. On his desk sat a letter with 1 sentence left unfinished. "To the board, effective immediately, I resign as Chief Executive Officer." He'd been staring at it for an hour, unable to decide whether to finish the line or close the laptop for good. The room around him was silent, except for the ticking of a watch he didn't remember winding. Behind him, a photo of his wife and daughter watched over his shoulder, the 2 faces that had once filled every corner of his life. His daughter Emily would have been 3 this month, if she'd lived. The doctors had said complications. He remembered rushing through traffic rain, slashing the windshield, the phone lighting up with his wife's last message. "She's hungry. I'm alone." He hadn't made it in time. Since then, every night had been a negotiation with ghosts. So when his phone vibrated, Evan nearly ignored it. But something, a flicker of instinct, a whisper from a place he'd long buried, made him glance down. A new message. Unknown number. A newborn's photo appeared on his screen, her cheeks flushed from the effort of arriving, and beneath it, 3 words. "She's hungry. I'm alone." He froze. For 1 long, silent minute, he couldn't breathe. The room around him seemed to shrink, the rain outside pressing against the windows, like memory itself. It wasn't possible. He checked the number again. Not his wife's. Not a prank. Just another woman somewhere in this same city, whispering into the void exactly what he had once failed to answer. Evan stood up. He didn't call security. He didn't forward the message to an assistant. He didn't think about what it would look like a billionaire showing up uninvited in the middle of the night with a bag of diapers. He just knew one thing: this time, I will show up. By the time Nora realized her mistake, it was too late. The rain had grown heavier, tapping impatiently against the window, like fingers on glass. She tried to delete the message but saw the read receipt appear too fast. Whoever she'd sent it to had already seen it. "Oh no," she whispered. Panic flushed through her. What if it was a scammer? What if it was her old landlord? What if her phone buzzed? A single line appeared. "I'm on my way. Don't be afraid." Her pulse stuttered. "On my way." "Who?" she typed. "Who is this?" But there was no reply. 20 minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate. The kind of steps that didn't belong to nurses in soft shoes. When the door opened, Nora's first instinct was to call for help. But the man in the doorway didn't look threatening. Just soaked. Rain clung to his coat. His hair dripped onto the linoleum. In his arms, he held a grocery bag from the all-night market down the street. "Ms. Williams?" he asked gently. His voice carried that calm authority of someone who was used to making impossible things happen. "Yes, I believe you texted me." She blinked, confused, then horrified. "Oh my God, you're Evan Hartley." The publishing guy, he almost smiled, weary and self-conscious. "That's me. But tonight, just Evan, you said your baby was hungry." Before she could protest, he moved toward the sink, washing his hands, like someone who'd done this before. He opened the bag. Newborn formula slow flow bottles. Tiny diapers. Wipes. Nora's throat tightened. "Why would you come here? You don't even know me." Evan's movements slowed. His gaze drifted to the baby, then back to Nora. "Because once I didn't go when someone needed me. I won't make that mistake again." There was something in his eyes, something beyond charity. A sorrow that had lived too long. He tested the bottle's temperature on his wrist and handed it to her. The baby latched immediately, the frantic cries softening into steady gulps. For the first time that night, the room exhaled. Nora watched him. The stranger who had answered a message, never meant for him, standing by the hospital window, with rain streaming behind him like silver threads. When the baby finally drifted into sleep, Nora said quietly, "You really didn't have to come." Evan nodded. "I know." He looked at the tiny sleeping face, his voice barely more than breath. "But I think I needed to." Outside, the rain kept falling softer now, more like a confession than a storm. In another life, they might have passed each other in a lobby, exchanged polite nods, remained strangers, forever. But on that night, a wrong message found the right heart. And maybe, just maybe, that was how love began, not with fireworks or promises, but with a single act of presence when the world felt empty. If you've ever been alone and someone showed up, maybe just to hold your hand or to listen, then you already know what love really is. It isn't grand. It isn't loud. It's simply being there when no one else is. The storm eased into a whisper as dawn crept over the city, turning the windows of the maternity ward a pale, reluctant blue. Nora woke to the sound of soft voices in the hallway, nurses trading shifts, coffee cups clinking. Her baby stirred, small fists opening and closing against her chest. For a brief, sweet moment, she believed the night's events had been only a dream. The knock at the door, the man with the rain in his hair, the warmth in his voice as he said her name, as if it mattered. But the grocery bag on the chair was still there, half open, filled with formula cans and diapers. His coat hung on the rack, still damp. He had really come. Evan was sitting by the window, coatless now, the gray light painting his face in soft, weary strokes. He looked different in daylight, less like a CEO, more like a man who hadn't slept in years. He was holding a paper cup of hospital coffee and studying the skyline, as if it were a language only he could read. "Good morning," Nora said quietly. He turned startled, then smiled, the kind of smile that carried both apology and gentleness. "Good morning. How's she doing?" "He's fine," Nora said. "She finally slept." Evan nodded. "That's good. Babies know when the storm is ending." She almost laughed. "I'm not sure the storm's over yet." He looked at her for a long time, then said softly, "But you made it through the night. That's something." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that isn't awkward, only tender. The rain outside became a shimmer on the glass, like the world had taken a breath. Nora studied him. He didn't fit in this small white room. Everything about him was too large. His shoulders, his presence, the quiet certainty in the way he looked at things. And yet he seemed strangely at home there, as if being near this fragile new life steadied something inside him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Why did you really come?" He hesitated. "Because you asked. That can't be all." Evan exhaled, glancing at the cup in his hands. "There was someone once. She sent me a message like yours. I didn't answer in time." His voice thinned, barely holding steady. "So when I saw your words, she's hungry. I'm alone." I couldn't stay still. Maybe it was foolish, but I couldn't do nothing again. Nora's throat tightened. The simplicity of it, his sorrow folded into action, moved her in a way she hadn't expected. "I didn't mean to bother you," she said. He looked up. "You didn't. You reminded me what it means to care for someone without reason." Outside, a nurse knocked lightly and peeked in. "You two need anything?" Evan stood. "Could we have one more blanket?" He asked, his tone so natural that the nurse nodded without a second glance. When she left, Nora said, "You didn't have to stay all night." "I know," he answered, but it didn't feel right to leave. Later, as he helped her gather the hospital forms and fold the baby's blanket, Nora noticed the way he moved carefully, as if afraid of breaking the air between them. His phone buzzed with messages she knew he was ignoring. There was a life waiting for him, somewhere far above hers, in buildings with marble floors, and assistants who said, "Sir, do you have children?" She asked, then regretted it. He paused. "I did," he said simply. "A daughter." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. She reached for Amara's tiny hand, tracing the curve of her palm. "She would have liked you, I think," Nora whispered. Evan smiled, just barely. "You'd be surprised how few people do." The baby stirred again, eyes fluttering open, and Evan leaned closer, the hint of awe on his face unmistakable. "She's beautiful," he said. "She's mine," Nora answered, half proud, half terrified. "That's the bravest sentence I've ever heard." When the discharge nurse arrived with paperwork, Evan stepped back, slipping into the background as though he understood this was Nora's moment to stand on her own. He waited by the window while she signed forms, his hands clasped loosely behind him. When everything was done, he turned to her. "Do you have a way home? My cousin's supposed to pick me up," she said. "She's just late." He nodded. "Then I'll wait with you." "You don't have to." "I know," he said again, and stayed. They didn't speak much after that. The minutes stretched softly between them. Outside, the city began to wake buses humming umbrellas, blooming like dark flowers. When her cousin finally arrived, Nora gathered her things. She turned to Evan, unsure of the right words. Thank you, she said, though it felt too small. He shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Still, she reached out and touched his hand. His skin was cool, his grip careful. Most people would have ignored a stranger's message. Maybe he said. But sometimes, the wrong message finds the right person. As he watched her walk toward the exit carrying the sleeping child, something inside him shifted, something quiet and long frozen. The elevator doors closed, leaving him with the scent of newborn powder and rain. For the first time in 3 years, Evan Hartley felt the faint, unfamiliar pulse of hope. He turned back to the window, the rain streaking silver paths down the glass. Somewhere out there, the city moved on. But he stayed a moment longer, listening to the steady heartbeat of rain against steel, and thought, maybe some storms are meant to be survived together, even if we arrive late. No plea, no promise, just the lingering warmth of 2 lives that had touched, however briefly, in the soft gray dawn after a very long night. For 2 days, the city carried on as cities always do. The rain lightened. The buses sighed through intersections, and life returned to its steady rhythm. Yet for Nora, time moved differently. The hospital smell still clung to her skin, but her small apartment 3 rooms above a corner bakery felt almost foreign when she stepped back inside. The crib waited in the corner, a gift from her cousin. Half-built screws missing. The refrigerator hummed softly, a lonely sound. She laid Amara down on the couch, wrapped in a blanket too large for her tiny body. The baby stirred, yawned, and fell asleep again. For the first time in days, Nora was truly still. And then it hit her. The man who had shown up in the middle of the night was real. Not a dream, not a kind hallucination, brought on by exhaustion. Evan Hartley. The man whose company's logo appeared on billboards and book jackets had stood in that hospital room with her and fed her child. She didn't know what to do with that kind of kindness. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, just checking. Is she eating better? Nora read it 3 times before replying. She's fine, thank you. You didn't have to message. I know, came his reply, but I wanted to be sure. She smiled, despite herself. Across the city, Evan sat at his kitchen counter staring at his phone long after the message was sent. The penthouse was too clean, too silent. His assistant had dropped off a folder of contracts that morning, each requiring his signature. They sat unopened. He didn't know why he'd texted her. It wasn't habit, he hadn't reached out to anyone in months. But the image of that young woman, worn and trembling, yet holding her child, like she was holding the entire world together, refused to leave him. He poured coffee, but it had no taste. His therapist had once told him that grief doesn't disappear, it changes temperature. It goes from fire to ice. Then, if you're lucky, to something you can hold without burning. Nora and her baby had warmed something in him he'd thought long dead. That afternoon, a new storm rolled in thin gray rain that carried more sadness than thunder. Nora sat by the window, baby on her chest, laptop open to a blank document. She needed to start working again, but her body felt like it belonged to someone else. Bills sat unopened on the table. A text from her landlord blinked red. She tried to think of designs for a client, but her brain wouldn't settle. Instead, she found herself searching Hartley and Row Publishing. His face appeared in a dozen news photos, the perfect tie, the distant smile, the caption calling him Seattle's youngest publishing mogul. He didn't look like the man who'd stood in her hospital room. That man had been softer undone, somehow human. When Amara cried, Nora lifted her gently and whispered, "You remember him, don't you? The man who brought the bottle." The baby blinked, her dark eyes solemn as if she did. By evening, Evan found himself parked on a quiet street near the bakery downstairs, from Nora's apartment. He told himself he was only out for a drive. He told himself he wasn't planning anything. But the truth was simpler. He wanted to see if she was all right. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of her pacing with the baby in her arms. The sight should have made him leave, but he stayed watching her hum softly, her body swaying in rhythm with the rain. There was no glamour there, no wealth, nothing extraordinary. And yet something in her calm persistence made the world feel steadier. He thought of his wife, how she'd once rocked their infant the same way. He thought of the text message that never reached him in time, and for the first time, he didn't feel the ache of failure, only the fragile peace of having done something right, however small. He drove away before she could see him. That night, Nora's phone buzzed again. "Storm's bad tonight. Keep her warm." She typed, "We're okay. Thank you, Mr. Hartley." After a pause, he replied, "It's Evan. Just Evan." She stared at the screen, then typed, "Good night, Evan." He didn't respond, but she didn't need him to. The next morning, Nora woke to a rare patch of sunlight streaming across the floor. The world looked different, not fixed, but softer around the edges. She brewed a cup of coffee and opened her laptop. A new email sat in her inbox. Subject: design proposal for Hartley and Rowe. From careers@hartleyrowe.com. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then she smiled, tired, unsure, but with a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Across town, Evan signed the email himself before forwarding it to HR. He didn't tell them why, only that a talented designer had caught his attention. He stood by the window, coffee cooling beside him, the city alive again beneath the clearing clouds. Somewhere out there, a mother was singing to her baby. And though he didn't quite understand it, the sound of her imagined lullaby made the morning feel almost like forgiveness. The following weeks passed like ripples in a quiet pond, slow, delicate, and full of the kind of small changes that only reveal themselves in hindsight. Every morning, Nora would wake before the city did. She'd feed Amara, hum to her softly, and then open her laptop while the baby slept in a bassinet beside the desk. Freelance projects trickled in: logos, layouts, small contracts that paid just enough to cover rent and formula. But there was always the quiet fear beneath the surface. One missed invoice, one illness, and everything could unravel. Then came the email that changed the rhythm of her days. Subject: design proposal accepted. Welcome to the Hartley and Rowe campaign team. The words felt almost unreal. She reread them 3 times before daring to smile. Across the city, Evan Hartley watched from his office window as spring pressed against Seattle's glass towers. He'd spent weeks trying not to think about the woman with the baby, but every time he passed the maternity wing during a hospital board meeting or saw a mother lifting her child into a car seat, something inside him stirred. He told himself it was gratitude, not attachment. Gratitude that her accidental message had pulled him back from a place he'd never admit aloud. Gratitude that someone else's need had forced him to remember he still had something to give. But when her name appeared in the project roster, Nora Williams, design consultant, his pulse did a strange, unmistakable thing. Coincidence, he told himself. He even said it aloud. But it didn't sound convincing, even to him. Their first professional exchange was through email. Evan, welcome to the campaign team, Ms. Williams. Your previous freelance work was excellent. We're glad to have you. Nora. Thank you, Mr. Hartley. I'll do my best not to let you down. Evan. You already haven't. She read that line 3 times before she realized what he meant, and by then, she was smiling. The campaign project was for a children's literacy foundation, one of Hartley and Rowe's more personal initiatives. It involved designing community spaces inside libraries, filled with color stories and comfort. Nora poured herself into it. Her sketches reflected warmth, belonging, hope. When she sent them off, she half expected silence. Instead, she received a short reply from Evan's personal address. "You have a way of making words feel safe. That's rare." She didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't. Late one evening, as the sky bruised violet over the city, Nora found herself thinking about him again. Not the CEO version in the headlines, but the man who had stood dripping rainwater on a hospital floor holding a bottle with trembling hands. There was something deeply human in him, something unguarded that most people would never see. And though she didn't fully understand it, she missed that version of him, the quiet man who had shown up when no one else did. Amara stirred in her sleep. Nora bent down to tuck the blanket closer and whispered, "He's just someone who helped us, that's all." But her voice didn't sound entirely certain. Evan stayed late at the office most nights. His assistants assumed it was habit, that old workaholic rhythm returning. In truth, he simply couldn't bear the stillness of home. The empty rooms, the untouched piano, the photo of his daughter on the mantel, all reminders of a life interrupted. But now, when the silence grew too heavy, he opened Nora's design files. The colors, the shapes, the handwritten notes in the margins, they breathed life into the sterile glow of his computer screen. He didn't know her well, but through her work he began to understand the kind of woman she was: practical, but tender, weary, but unbroken. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that steadiness soothed him more than any therapist's advice ever had. Weeks later, they met in person again, this time in the bright conference room of Hartley and Rowe. She was nervous, clutching a folder of sketches to her chest, as if it were armor. He greeted her with the same quiet smile that had disarmed her in the hospital. "Good to see you again," he said. "You too." She answered, her voice almost steady. They discussed layouts, budgets, the placement of reading corners, and mural designs. The conversation was professional, polite, until she pointed to one of her sketches and said softly, "This corner should feel like someone's waiting for you when you walk in." Evan looked at her, the pencil still in his hand. "You really believe places can do that?" "I think people can," she said. "And sometimes places just borrow that feeling." For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "You're right." Something in his voice, something unguarded, made her look away. That night, as he rode the elevator down from his office, Evan caught his reflection in the mirrored walls and barely recognized himself. The man staring back wasn't healed, not yet, but the edges of his grief had softened just a little. He thought of the rain-soaked night that had started it all, of the message that had been meant for someone else, and of the small child now sleeping somewhere above a bakery. Maybe fate didn't work in grand gestures. Maybe it simply whispered through the cracks, reminding the broken that they still had something to give, and someone somewhere who might notice. And for the first time in a long while, when he stepped out into the street and felt the night air on his face, Evan Hartley didn't feel entirely alone. It began with a cough, a small ordinary sound, barely a whisper from the crib beside Nora's bed. She stirred, half asleep, thinking it was nothing, but when she reached over and felt the baby's skin, her hand froze. Amara was burning. The clock read 2:13 a.m. The rain had returned, steady and relentless, brushing against the window like anxious fingers. Nora sat up, panic crawling through her veins. She checked the thermometer twice, hoping it was wrong. 102.7. Okay, she whispered, rocking the baby in trembling arms. "It's just a fever. Babies get fevers." But Amara's breathing was too fast. Her small chest rose and fell like a bird caught in wind. Nora fumbled for her phone, scrolling for the nurse hotline, her hands shaking too hard to tap the right numbers. The baby whimpered a soft, pitiful sound that broke her heart cleanly in two. And before she knew what she was doing, she opened her messages and typed the only name that came to mind. Nora. She's burning up. I'm taking her to the ER. She didn't expect him to answer. It was late. He was probably asleep, or more likely working in some tall glass room, far from the world of night cries and thermometers. But less than a minute later, the screen lit up. Evan. Which hospital, Nora? Same one as before. Evan, I'm coming. She almost protested, typed, "You don't have to," but the words wouldn't form. Maybe because part of her wanted him there. Maybe because, deep down, she already knew he'd come. By the time she reached the emergency room, the waiting area was nearly empty. The lights were harsh, the air cold. A nurse at the desk took her name and waved her toward a row of plastic chairs. Nora sat with Amara pressed against her chest, whispering lullabies that came out as prayers. The fever made the child's skin damp and flushed her tiny hands, curling weakly around Nora's shirt. Minutes passed, or hours. It was hard to tell. Then a voice broke through the sterile quiet. "Ms. Williams." She looked up. Evan stood there, rain still dripping from his coat, his tie-loosened eyes full of concern. "Oh God," she breathed. "You didn't have to." "I told you," he said gently. "I come when someone needs me." He stayed with her through everything. The triage questions, the IV line, the soft cries that tore at every nerve in Nora's body. When the doctor finally smiled and said, "It's a viral fever. She'll be fine," Nora felt her knees weaken with relief. Evan caught her before she could fall. "Hey," he said softly, steadying her. "She's okay. You did good." For the first time in her adult life, Nora let someone else hold her while she cried. They sat together in the quiet room, Amara sleeping between them, her little chest rising and falling, with even breaths now. "You shouldn't have come," Nora whispered. Evan smiled faintly. "If you think that would have stopped me, you don't know me very well." She looked at him, then really looked. The deep lines around his eyes, the faint gray at his temples, the tiredness that didn't dull his kindness. "You look like someone who hasn't rested in a long time," she said. He gave a small, rueful laugh. "I forgot how." Nora turned back to her child. "I forget too," she said. But then she smiles. And somehow that's enough. For a while they said nothing. The hospital's hum filled the space, the beeping monitors, the muted footsteps in the hall, the whisper of rain on the windows. Evan's voice came softly, as if from far away. "When Emily was sick, I didn't know what to do. I thought money could fix it. Doctors, treatment specialists, none of it mattered. I didn't stay the night. I thought she'd be fine." He paused, swallowing the memory. "When you texted that night, I thought, maybe I could rewrite something. Just one thing." Nora listened, her heart tightening. "You did," she said quietly. "You showed up." He looked at her, then his eyes bright with something unspoken. "Maybe that's all any of us can do." By morning, the rain had stopped. A faint blush of light crept through the hospital blinds. Amara stirred her fever-broken cheeks, cool and rosy again. "She's smiling," Evan said, a small wonder in his voice. Nora brushed a finger along the baby's hair. "She's saying thank you." He chuckled softly. "I think she's saying breakfast." When the nurse came with the discharge papers, Evan offered to drive them home. Nora hesitated, then nodded. In the car, the city gleamed from the rain, everything washed clean, reflective. Evan drove slowly, careful over each puddle, as if the world had suddenly become fragile. At a stoplight, Nora looked out at the skyline, her baby sleeping in the back seat. "You know," she said, "you keep showing up at the worst moments of my life." He smiled. "Maybe they're not the worst moments. Maybe they're just beginnings that don't know what they are yet." She turned to him then, really seeing the man beside her. The grief was still there, yes, but so was something gentler, something that looked a little like grace. And for the first time since her daughter was born, Nora felt something new blooming in the quiet space between fear and gratitude. It wasn't love yet, not quite, but it was something that might one day grow into it. By early summer, the rain had given way to long stretches of soft, forgiving sunlight, the kind that lingered on windowsills and made the world feel almost tender again. Nora settled into a rhythm she hadn't known she was capable of. Mornings began with Amara's quiet cooing and the smell of coffee drifting through her apartment. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. They felt lived in, safe, warm, touched by laughter. Her work with Hartley and Rowe had grown. The children's literacy campaign was nearing its final stage, and for the first time, she was invited to the downtown office for team meetings. She dressed carefully each time, simple blouses, her curls pinned neatly, and carried a notebook filled with sketches. Each visit she saw Evan. Sometimes across the conference table, sometimes only in passing. He was different there, composed, decisive, surrounded by people who seemed to orbit him like small moons. Yet, every now and then, she'd catch him looking her way, a quiet glance that said more than words dared to. One afternoon, the meeting ran late. The rest of the team drifted out until it was only the two of them, papers scattered between them and the hum of the city faint through the glass walls. Evan leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie. "You've changed this project," he said. "How so?" she asked. "You gave it a heart," he replied simply. "Before it was just funding and strategy. Now it feels human." She smiled, brushing her pencil across the margin of a sketch. "Maybe it just needed a little warmth." "Maybe I did too," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, unhurried, like something fragile that neither wanted to startle. Outside the office, their connection found its own quiet language. A message here and there, never too much, never enough to draw notice. "Evan, did she sleep last night?" "Nora, not really. But she laughs now, like she's telling jokes only she understands." "Evan." "That's a good sign. People who laugh at their own jokes are strong." "Nora. You sound like you know from experience." He sent back a single smile emoji, oddly human, coming from him. Sometimes he'd stop by with a box of books for the foundation, pretending it was business. Sometimes she'd email him a draft and find his reply within minutes, even late at night. They never talked about what any of it meant. They didn't have to. In early July, Nora invited him to the neighborhood library, where the campaign's first reading space was being built. It was a small branch tucked between a grocery store and a laundromat, humble but alive with possibility. He arrived in rolled-up sleeves, carrying a tray of coffees, and for once, he didn't look like a man from the papers. He looked ordinary, approachable, maybe even happy. Nora watched as he helped the volunteers arrange children's chairs and hang bright illustrations along the wall. When a little boy tugged at his sleeve and asked for help stacking picture books, Evan knelt down, patient and unhurried, listening to every word. Later, when the child ran off laughing, Nora said softly, "You're good with them." He looked at her almost shyly. "I wasn't once." "What changed?" He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Maybe I started remembering instead of regretting." She nodded. "That's a good way to live." That evening, when the volunteers left and the library grew quiet, They lingered in the glow of the overhead lights. Amara was asleep in her stroller, her small face peaceful. Evan leaned against a shelf watching Nora as she adjusted one last sign. "You've built something beautiful here," he said. She corrected. He shook his head. "No, I just showed up. You made it matter." She turned to face him. Then her expression, soft searching. "You keep saying that. But maybe showing up is what makes everything else possible." Their eyes held for a moment, long enough for understanding, but not long enough to be dangerous. He broke the silence first. "I should go." She smiled faintly. "You always say that, right before you don't." He laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that startled them both. "You're right," he said, glancing toward the sleeping baby. "But tonight, I think you've got someone else who needs you more." She watched him leave the door, closing softly behind him. For a long time after she stood in the still library, the hum of the city just beyond the windows, the faint smell of new books in the air. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing down. Instead, there was something lighter, almost shy, beginning to unfold, like the first bloom after a long, cold season. It wasn't love yet, but it was close enough to touch. The summer drifted into that kind of quiet September Seattle knows so well, soft skies, low clouds, and air that smelled faintly of rain waiting to begin again. For Nora, the days had found a peaceful rhythm. Work laughter, the warm heaviness of Amara asleep against her shoulder. There was comfort now in the ordinary, in knowing that her world, small as it was, had steadied itself after so much trembling. But one evening, while reviewing campaign drafts in the Hartley and Row office, she discovered a file that wasn't meant for her eyes. She hadn't meant to find it. She'd been searching through the shared drive looking for design references when a document appeared at the top of the list. To Nora Williams. Unsent. Her hand froze on the mouse. For a long moment, she simply stared at the name, her name lit against the screen. She should have closed it. She should have respected the boundary. But curiosity and something deeper, something tender, fearful, and unspoken guided her hand. She clicked. The letter began without greeting. "I started writing this because I didn't know how to say it aloud. You might never see it, and maybe that's for the best. But after that night, the message that was never meant for me, I've been thinking about how strange mercy can be." Nora's breath caught. "I was on the edge of leaving everything behind when your text arrived. I'd written my resignation letter. I'd left my wedding ring on the counter. I was ready to be done with this life that had become too quiet to bear. And then your message appeared word for word, like the last one my wife sent me. The same plea, the same rhythm. I thought I was hallucinating." Her eyes blurred as she read. "I drove because I needed to see if it was real. If you were real. Maybe it was selfish. Maybe it was something else. But when I saw you holding that child, shaking and afraid, I realized that life was still asking something of me. That I hadn't finished giving what I was meant to give." The next line was simple, almost hesitant. "You didn't save me on purpose, but you did." Nora pressed a hand to her lips. "If I seem distant, it's because I'm still learning how to be in a world that gives second chances. You remind me that grace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes quietly, like a message sent to the wrong number that turns out to be exactly right. There was no signature, only a date 6 weeks ago." The office was empty except for the low hum of the city beyond the glass. Nora sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, unsure whether to cry or smile. She thought of that night in the hospital, the rain, his trembling hands, the way he'd said, "Because last time I didn't come." Now she understood what he meant. It wasn't just kindness. It was penance. It was healing. And perhaps quietly, it was love. When she saw him the next morning, he was standing by the window, his reflection half-shadowed in the glass. He turned when she entered, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, nervousness maybe. "You were here late last night," he said softly. "I was," she answered. Then after a pause, "I found something." His expression changed. "Ah, I wasn't looking for it," she said, "but I read it." He nodded slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Then I suppose I don't need to explain." She shook her head. "No, but maybe you could tell me why you didn't send it." He thought for a long time before answering. "Because it wasn't fair to ask anything of you. You had your own life, your own rebuilding to do. I didn't want to place my ghosts in your hands." Her voice softened. "You already did, and I didn't mind." He turned then, meeting her gaze fully. The silence between them stretched fragile and unguarded. "I wasn't ready," he said, and now, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Now I'm learning how to be." Later that day, when the meeting ended and the others filed out, Nora lingered by the doorway. The late afternoon light spilled across the room, gilding the edges of his desk. His face, the faint lines of weariness that no longer seemed so heavy. "Evan," she said softly. He looked up. "Sometimes," she began, "letters don't have to be sent to reach the person they're meant for." He held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them, a quiet understanding that whatever bound them was no longer accidental. When she turned to leave, he said her name once, almost reverently. She didn't look back, but she smiled. Outside, the rain began again, not fierce this time, but tender, like the sound of forgiveness falling softly on a city ready to listen. The rain lifted that morning, as though the city itself had decided to give them mercy. The sky stretched pale and wide, the kind of blue Seattle only showed on its gentlest days. The new children's library. The Emily room stood bright and finished, its walls painted in soft yellow and pale green. The shelves gleamed with books that smelled of promise. Paper butterflies hung from the ceiling, catching the light. It had taken months of planning, hundreds of hours, and the quiet persistence of two people who had once met by accident. But now it was real. Nora stood near the window, Amara balanced on her hip, watching the children spill in with laughter and backpacks. She wore a simple white dress. Her curls framed her face like a crown of soft defiance. Evan was across the room, shaking hands, thanking donors, smiling in that unguarded way she had learned was rare. He looked different today, lighter, freer. When he caught her eye across the crowd, he paused just for a heartbeat, and the noise of the room seemed to fall away. He crossed to her slowly, as though afraid the moment might vanish if he hurried. "You did this," he said quietly. She shook her head. "We did." He looked around the room, the bright colors, the sound of children's voices, and then back at her. "You know," he said softly, "the night I met you, I thought I was rescuing someone. I didn't realize you were saving me." Nora smiled, her eyes shining. "Maybe that's what grace looks like. We take turns saving each other." He laughed under his breath, a little unsteady. "You make it sound so simple." "It isn't," she said, "but it's real." Later, when the ceremony ended and the guests began to leave, they found themselves outside beneath the awning. The rain had stopped completely. The air smelled of wet earth and sunlight. Amara slept in her stroller, one small hand open, as if reaching for something she already trusted. For a long while, they said nothing. Evan finally spoke, his voice low. "I used to think love was supposed to be loud, grand gestures, fireworks, all of it. But maybe it's this instead. Quiet. Steady. Like showing up, Nora said. Exactly. He hesitated, then reached for her hand. His touch was gentle, uncertain, as though he were still asking permission to believe in something good. She didn't pull away. Do you ever think about that first message, he asked. All the time, he smiled. Wrong number. She met his eyes. Right person. The city hummed softly around them. Sunlight pooled on the wet pavement, turning every puddle into a small, shining mirror. And for the first time since that long, dark night in February, Evan Hartley felt completely alive. In the weeks that followed, life didn't become perfect. It became ordinary in the most beautiful way. Nora worked, raised her daughter, and sometimes found fresh flowers waiting on her doorstep with no note. Evan still lost himself in deadlines and meetings, but he stopped eating dinner alone. There were no declarations, no grand endings, just two people learning slowly and honestly how to begin again. One evening, long after the library lights had dimmed, Nora sat by the window of her apartment. The air was still, the kind of quiet that made you notice your own heartbeat. She opened her phone and scrolled to the first message, the one she had sent by accident. She's hungry. I'm alone. She read it, smiled, and whispered to herself, not anymore. Outside, the rain began again, soft, patient, forgiving. Sometimes life gives us second chances in the smallest, strangest ways. A wrong number, a quiet act of kindness, a moment we almost overlook. If this story found you when your heart felt tired, let it remind you, there is always someone out there meant to meet you halfway. Sometimes all it takes is to send the message to open the door to show up. Love doesn't always come crashing in. Sometimes it just knocks softly and waits.